Okay. Do something a little different here. Without a whole lot of preamble, we're just going to jump into it. Last Stand at Papago Wells, Louis L'Amour. Written, published in 1957. This book I've read a lot of Louis L'Amour. I know his style. I know some of the, not to say they use a template, but it kind of has the same program throughout his stories. And, but this one I've not read. It's only about 120-something pages. So without further ado, Chapter 1. He had stopped last night in the Gunside Hills, making dry camp because others had reached the waterhole before him, and he preferred to avoid other travelers. At daybreak he came down out of the hills and made a little dust as he struck westward, with Yuma Crossing in his mind. Logan Cates had the look of the desert about him, a brown, seasoned man with straight black hair above a triangular face that was all bone and tight-drawn, sun-browned hide. His eyes, narrow from squinting into sun and wind, were a cold green that made a man stop and think before he looked into them a second time. You'll notice Louis L'Amour, when he starts out with his main characters, they're not saints or sinners. They usually come from, they could go, they have potentiality, either be good or bad. He was a tall man, wide in the shoulder and lean in waist and hips, an easy-moving man with none of the horseman's awkwardness in walking. He moved like a hunter when on his own feet, and had been a hunter of many things, men not least among them. His hat was black and flat-crowned and flat-brimmed, held beneath his jaw by a loose thong. His shirt, once red, had faded to an indeterminate rose. His vest was a black cowhide, worn and scratched, and over his black jeans he wore fringed shotgun chaps. He wore a tied-down Smith & Wesson Russian .44 six-shooter, and the Winchester in his saddle scabbard was the vintage of '73. The horse he rode, a long-legged zebra dun, had a wicked eye that hinted at the tough, resilient, and often vicious nature within. I think I own that horse. A horse of many brands, he had the speed of a frightened coyote and an ability to go without water equal to any camel or longhorn steer. Logan Cates was a man without illusions, without wealth, place, or destination. In the 18 years since his parents died of cholera when he was 14, he had driven a freight wagon, punched cows, hunted buffalo, twice gone over the trail from Texas to Kansas with cattle, scouted for the Army, and had ridden shotgun on many stages. Twice, also, he had been marshal of boomtowns for brief periods. He had lived without plan, following his horse's ears and coping with each day's problems as they arose. Not an hour out of the Gunside Hills, he drew rein in the bottom of a dry wash and crawled to the lip of the wash to survey the desert. Lifting his head among some small boulders to keep from skylining it, he studied the situation with care, having long ago learned that vigilance was the price of life in Indian country. Far away toward the line that divided Mexico from Arizona was a dust cloud. 10, he judged, maybe 12 riders. The knowledge was disturbing, for when so many men came together in this country, it spelled trouble, and no news had come his way since riding out of Tucson almost 4 days before, and he knew enough of the desert to the south to realize no man would ride there without desperate reason. A dozen men would mean a posse, a band of outlaws, Indians, or an army patrol out of Fort Yuma. The latter was highly improbable, as there had been no trouble in the area for some time, and the Apaches rarely came so far west. Yet, with Cherupatai in the field, no dependence could be placed on that guess, for his mother had been a Yaqui, giving him ties in western Sonora. Returning to the saddle, Logan Cates resumed his westward trek, moving more slowly and trying to lift no dust. Considering this group of riders to the south and the three who had last night stopped at Gunsight Wells, the country was becoming too busy for comfort. The three at Gunsight had been too far away to distinguish details, but their fire had been far larger than any Indian would build. The trail they followed lay 50 yards off to his right, for Logan Cates had an aversion to leaving his tracks where they might be easily seen. As it was, his trail was unlikely to be found unless by riders coming into the trail from the south. All travel in this western Arizona desert was circumscribed by the necessity for water, and the fact that in several hundred square miles there were only a few widely scattered water holes, and none of these reliable in a dry season. No matter what route a man wished to take, his trail must at some time touch these water holes, for without them he would die. Ahead of him, and at least 20 miles from his camp of last night, lay one of these water holes. It lay in the gap through which went the trail west, but he had been warned in Tucson that the water hole might be empty and it could in no case be depended upon. The nearest water beyond the gap was at Papago Wells, on the edge of the lava beds to the south, a good 20 miles further. Unless all signs failed, he would find company at one or both water holes, but there was no help for it. This was a land of little water and less rain, where trails were indicated by the bones of men and animals that had died beside them, and all lines of travel were dictated by the urgency of water. Trails from all directions would converge on the water hole in the gap ahead of him, and if that tank proved dry, then he must ride at once for Papago Wells, a grim and lonely place with its three dark pools lying in their basins of bluish-black basaltic rock. Beyond this place, the nearest water was at Tule Tank. 30 miles further on the Yuma Trail, although an Indian had once told Cates of a place called Heart Tank in the Sierra Pinta north of Papago Wells. Nobody else he knew had heard of Heart Tank, and Cates knew how slight were the chances of finding water without adequate directions. Such a tank might exist high in the rocks as at Tenejas Altas, where men had died within a few feet of water they could not find, or who lacked the strength for the climb to its place among the high rocks. It was very hot. Logan Cates squinted his eyes against the shimmering heat waves and studied the dust of the riders who had camped last night at Gunsight Wells, who were also heading due west. A glance to the south indicated the larger group had drawn closer, but were still distanced by many miles. It would be well to ride up to Papago with a ready gun, for in this country many a man had been murdered for his horse. Several times he drew up to study the country, uneasily aware that for this lonely desert there was too much movement. At this moment, unknown to him, half a dozen parties of horsemen were riding toward an unexpected rendezvous at Papago Wells, and with each rode the shadow of fear, and some had already been brushed by death. Far to the north, on another trail toward the gap, were two riders. As yet they knew nothing of those who rode south of them, and were concerned with nothing in that direction, but from time to time they turned to look along their back trail, and of the two the man showed the greater apprehension. Tall and spare, he carried himself in the saddle as a former cavalryman should. His features were clean cut, his mustache trimmed carefully, and under the brim of his white hat his eyes were piercing blue. Unquestionably handsome, he had the appearance of a strong, purposeful man, and despite the pattering of the desert dust, the black coat he wore looked trim and neat. He was a man who rode well and went armed, and the horse he rode was a splendid chestnut, bred for bred for the Virginia hills rather than these sandy, rock-strewn wastelands. The man rode with assurance, and the girl he rode beside was quick to notice it. She was tall, her dark hair drawn back and knotted loosely, her eyes blue-gray and large. Her every feature indicated breeding, yet there was something more than breeding or beauty in her face. There was a hint of fine steel not yet honed to a cutting edge. That's a Louis L'Amourism right there. Do you think your father will follow us? He'll follow. What will it serve if we are already married? He'll kill you, I think. He's my father, but he's a brute, and I saw him kill a man once. I believe I've hated him ever since. Someone you knew? No, only by sight. I had seen him around the town, and once he had come to the ranch, but he was a young, gay, handsome. He was young, gay, handsome. 1957, gay meant a whole lot of different things. He was a young, handsome man. I quite lost my heart to him when I was 10 or 11, and then my father killed him. I never knew why. Dusk climbed around them, and the desert offered no sound but the sound of their travel. Despite the heat, the girl of the gray horse looked neat, cool, perfectly composed. She was, Grant Kimbrough decided, the best thing that had happened to him since the Civil War brought his world to an untimely end. His given name had come to him from his father, who'd fought through the Mexican War beside a grim, cigar-chewing soldier he had come to admire, and when that officer led the Union forces against the South, the elder Kimbrough saw no reason for his son to change his name. The blood of the Kimbroughs was good blood, and if there are some who say such blood wears thin with passing generation, there was no need to say this of Grant Kimbrough. At the time the war ended, he had fought well and ended the war with the rank of colonel. His father died at Missionary Hills, and Grant returned to an impoverished estate. It would take years to rebuild. His great-grandfather had begun with a wilderness, and although the land was still rich and fertile, the great-grandson elected to sell out for a song and go west. He was a man without skills other than those expected of a gentleman. He knew how to ride, to dance, to shoot. He held his liquor well and played an excellent game of cards. Yet he had become accustomed to good living, and feeling nothing could go wrong for Kimbrough, he spent the money received for the estate freely until one morning he awakened with less than $200 and no prospects. It was then he became a professional gambler. He began with the riverboats, then drawn by the irresistible tide that moved all things west, he proceeded from Kansas City to Ellsworth to Abilene to Dodge to Fort Worth, Cimarron, and Santa Fe. On the stage to Tucson, he met Jennifer Fair. Jennifer Fair was the only child of Jim Fair, a man who knew how to build an empire on grass, how to handle men, cattle, and Apaches, but never learned how to talk to his daughter, and therefore was never able to tell her how much she meant to him. His world had no place for soft words. It was abrupt, hard, dangerous, and profane, and he had lived it well enough to be ranked with Pierce, Slaughter, Goodnight, and Loving. Let me do that again. Well enough to be ranked with Pierce, Slaughter, Goodnight, and Loving, those kings among cattlemen. All the great cattle drives were those groups right there. Goodnight and Loving was the what was that? It'll come to me. Robert Duvall in that famous Western in the 80s. That came out, that was based on that cattle drive, those guys. When Jennifer reached her father's ranch, returning from the east, she was accompanied by Grant Kimbrough. The huge, rambling old stone house reminded him of the estates of his boyhood, and he liked the simple good taste of the Spanish furniture. After the gambling halls and riverboats, the great old house was subdued, peaceful, lovely. Day after day he rode with Jennifer, talked to her, and danced with her. Compared to the cowhands, he was everything to delight a woman. Knowing all the little courtesies in the gentleman's manner, Big Jim watched and was not pleased. But Kimbrough was his daughter's guest, and the day came when Grant Kimbrough proposed. Jennifer had quarreled with her father over some minor subject, and Grant sensed a coming break, a break he did not wish to occur. He proposed and was accepted. He approached Jim Fair with a request for his blessing and was given an hour to get off the ranch. He asked to marry the daughter. He said, "Get lost." Within the hour, Grant Kimbrough was gone, but he was joined at daylight by Jennifer, and together they rode to Tucson. That's a high-speed elope. No priest or minister of the gospel would marry them in Tucson without Jim Fair's blessing. Coldly furious, she spent the night with a girlfriend, and at daybreak rode west with Grant Kimbrough and a company of people bound for Ehrenberg. From where the trails divided, they would push on southwest to Yuma Crossing. North of the Gap, they parted company with their companions and started south at a good clip. Grant Kimbrough knew next to nothing of southern Arizona, but there seemed to be too many moving dust clouds, and they worried him. They had been pushing their horses hard when they rode into the Gap and stopped at Bates Well. Jennifer screamed. The two men who lay sprawled in death upon the hard-packed earth had been stripped and horribly mutilated. The cracked earth at the bottom of the dry waterhole was dark with their blood. Both men had been shot through with arrows and struck many times, and about their bodies were numerous tracks of the unshod ponies of the Indians. For the first time since he could remember, Grant Kimbrough knew fear. His soldiering experience told him these men had not long been dead, which meant the Indians might be in the vicinity even now. Jennifer, we've got to get away from here. They did not hear the man who came down from the rocks behind them. He was a tall boy, shyly attractive in manner, but there was no shyness in the way he held his rifle. His clothes were shabby, and when he came out of the rocks near the waterhole, he cleared his throat before speaking. "You folks headed west?" Kimbrough turned sharply, his hand automatically dropping for his gun. But when he saw the tall, slim boy who faced them, he merely said, "Who are you?" "If you folks are headed west, I'm hunting company. My name is Lonnie Foreman." I like him already for some reason. Kimbrough gestured at the dead men. "Do you know them?" "There were 14, maybe 15 Indians when we found the water gone. I crawled up on the rocks for a rock tank. One of these here Tanahas. I was up there when the Indians came, and before I could get place for a shot at it, was all over. We worked on a cattle outfit together and talked it over about California. Finally, we made it up to go west, and we got this far." Jennifer had kept her eyes averted, but her heart was throbbing heavily, and she kept thinking about the Indians. If there was one band here, there might be more, and she remembered stories her father had told of Indian forays. In any event, nothing was to be gained here. "We'd best go on," she said. "They might come back." "Closest water is 20 miles, Papago Wells." Lonnie Foreman turned to Jennifer. "Ma'am, if you'll allow it, I'd ride with you all." "Of course," she said. Grant Kimbrough had started to speak, then said nothing. Another man was added protection, and boy though he might be, in this country he was a man in years as well as height, and there was something impressive about the way he handled his rifle, something casual, easy, showing long familiarity. Due south of them was still another rock tank. This one known to Indians only by rumor to a few prospectors and Army scouts. There were Indians there now, 6 of them, with a recently captured white girl for prisoner. This gets more interesting by the sentence. Junie Hatchett was the last of her family. The others had died fighting in the battle after which Junie was captured. She was a prisoner now with no hope of help from any source at all. Nobody even knew she was alive, and so far as she was aware, there was no one to whom it mattered. She was a thin, frightened girl with the face of a tired waif, and she held herself very still now, afraid to breathe for fear it might draw attention to her. For a moment, there was little chance of that. The Indians were eating now, stuffing themselves on the half-raw meat of a captured mule. And when they were gorged, they would sleep, and the Junie intended to escape. She knew just how she would do it, and she knew, too, she would probably die in the desert. Cipriano Well was 10 miles from Bates Well in the gap through which the trail passed, and she knew it was at least 20 miles further to Papago Wells, but she would attempt to reach it. There was nearly always water there, and there were rocks in which to hide. Sooner or later, someone would come. Junie had never been to Papago Wells, but she had listened to the scout who guided their small bunch of wagons, and he had talked to them about it. She knew also that she would not live out tomorrow. When the half-starved Indians awakened, after eating she would be raped and killed. She knew very well they would kill her because this was a war party, and they were not returning to their homes in Mexico yet. She would be excess baggage when they were through with her. Holding her thin body very tight still, she watched the Indians and waited and hoped. Only a few miles away, the lone rider on the zebra dun paused briefly and rinsed his horse's mouth with water. He had come prepared for trouble and with two large canteens, and with luck he would reach Papago Wells shortly after sundown. Logan Cates mounted again and pushed out into the desert, riding west. That's chapter 1. Last stand at Papago Wells. Love you, God bless.